Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us at this webinar today. We are delighted to have Step once again with us, talking to us about the important and very sad topic of financial abuse. And I have a wonderful panel with me talking more generally about the issue, but also about specific stories and also about specific actions that we are taking as civil society. I will introduce my panel in a second. In the meantime, next slide, please. I'm introducing myself. I'm Paola Barbarino. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Alzheimer's Disease International. ADI was established in 1984. We are an umbrella organization of 105 Alzheimer's and Dementia Associations around the world. We represent our members at the WHO, at the UN, OECD, and other global and regional bodies. We promote the World Alzheimer's Month, and we are the publisher of the World Alzheimer Report. And our vision is for prevention, care, and inclusion today, as we hope for a cure tomorrow, although the cure is getting closer and closer. Next slide, please. So who are STEP? STEP is a global professional body which is active in many countries with more than 21,000 members. I think it's about 100 countries. Members are usually larger accountancy, financial, and a lot of lawyering firms. Their mission is to inspire confidence in families planning for assets across generations. And how they do that is by setting and upholding high professional standards in forming public policy, and then promoting education and connecting practitioners globally to share this knowledge and best practice. We have been delighted to have STEP amongst our supporters and partners now for about 3 years. We have learned a lot in this journey, and they've been incredibly helpful for us, because being present in 100 countries, it means that they've been able to advise us on legal issues that our members have really been able to take advantage of. Our partnership with STEP, I think, will finish at the beginning of next year. So please do write your question as you have them now, because at some point STEP will also support other organizations. So we are very lucky to have had their attention for the 3 years that we had. I also would like to remind you, that's the next slide, the ADI, I think we may be having a problem with slides. There we go. ADI is a non-for-profit organization, and we are fully funded by generous donations. If you are able and would like to donate to us, please use your smartphone and scan the QR code on this slide, or visit our website. And your donation really makes a difference for us. We are a charity. We don't receive endowments or donations regularly from anyone in particular. So we raise every penny we have, and we try and make everything that we publish and do free for you all to enjoy. Now, having said that, I'd like to welcome and introduce my panel. So we will start with a slightly longer presentation from Heledd, who is joining us today to talk more broadly about the topic of financial abuse. And that will be then followed by David Abednego. So, sorry, I should have read the title of Heledd. Sorry, Heledd. Heledd is partners in Rothley Law and the chair of the STEP Mental Capacity SIG Steering Committee. So she's right in the middle of the issue of mental capacity and what does that mean. The presentation of David Abednego, managing partner of Harbour Chambers in the British Virgin Islands, will focus on a specific issue of what happens then in practice in a particular nation. And that nation also happens to be a member of ADI. We'll also have a presentation from Daphne Franks, who is a campaigner for Predatory Marriage UK, who will tell us about a specific case that she has seen of financial abuse. And we will be concluding this session with Jennifer Hall, who is the head of National Support Services for Alzheimer Scotland UK. And Jennifer will be talking to us about how Scotland, in particular, as a member of ADI, has dealt with the topic of financial abuse, and in particular about raising awareness and also taking action on the topic. At the end of that, we will conclude the session and we will come for a Q&A. So I hope you will enjoy this with us. And I welcome, therefore, Heledd to start her presentation and tell us her viewpoint. Heledd, the floor is yours.
So, hello. Yeah, I'm Heledd Wynne. I'm a solicitor partner, and I'm here representing STEP to discuss issues about financial abuse, which is something we're seeing, sadly, all too often and increasingly so, and not necessarily in a way that people might think is appropriate. So STEP is a worldwide organisation, as Paola's very kindly explained, and part of the presentation and what will come around is some resource and some slides that you can have a look at. So I will be happy to point those out, and they will be circulated later for your own timing. So bit about me there. So if you wanted to find me at any point, then there I am. You'll find me both on STEP, my law firm, and if anybody's on LinkedIn, I'd be very happy to connect with you on there as well. So this all started with a report that we created, or STEP created in 2023, so coming up sort of a couple of years ago now, looking at the global perspective on mental capacity, because we were very concerned about that being an issue for lots of people. My slides are going quite fast, sorry about that. And the point of the report was that actually we were seeing that a lot of practitioners are seeing inadvertently that people are experiencing financial abuse. And you'll see here that there are 5 key points that we found in the report, that lots of issues about capacity, whether that's Alzheimer's, dementia, stroke, brain injury, could be all sorts of things that are affecting people and their ability to manage their affairs. And then perhaps they've got other people then helping them out. Then this is where the concern started, that we're seeing financial abuse increasing, where perhaps people are in a grey area, where capacity may not be sure that capacity is a problem, or it's fluctuating, or people are having good days and bad days, and there's uncertainty over who should be making the decisions about the money. And it's quite complicated capacity, so we don't want people to be sort of written off as soon as that they've had an illness or a diagnosis or an injury. But certainly it can be something that is difficult, because you might have somebody who's very good in the mornings, less good in the afternoons. We know that different types of dementia exhibit differently, and that their progression can be different. And then different illnesses outside the dementia sphere are also important. But we know that every person with dementia is a person with dementia, and there's no one size fits all. So what we really want to talk about in STEP is the whole concept about setting up powers of attorney as an important legal tool to allow people to think about future incapacity, which is great and a really important thing, but it comes in 2 parts. There's the creating the document, which is the first part, and then there's how does that document get used. And the real interest for us in STEP was how that is being used, because I think people are very good at creating the documents, but aren't necessarily understanding what they can and can't do with the document, and what they are entitled to do, what are allowed to do. And obviously we've got complicated families, we've got complicated relationships, people move around, people with cross-border issues, and I know here today we've got over 200 people on course day, and can see they're all over the world. So there's all sorts of issues that we need to be looking at. So the thing, oh, sorry, slightly enthusiastic slides. Here we go. So things that we've been seeing here in STEP, and I'm seeing sort of in practice, are the things where we're worried about financial abuse, where people are perhaps being coerced into making payments, giving money because they're vulnerable. The issue is that somebody might be influenced to give money because they are struggling with their own affairs, or they are having an issue themselves and they're wanting some more support. And the balance can tip between how people get assistance and what they can and can't do. It's very easy in a family to have one person being a carer and another person perhaps not being so hands-on, but they're both relatives and they're both family members, and they both might feel that it's something that they're struggling with, whereby who should be getting the recognition for what they're doing. And it can be something that you can see people going, well, I'm carer for my mother, my brother is not doing so much, so why shouldn't I get some compensation from what is happening for what I'm doing? I'm giving up my time. We and the sandwich generation, where we've got people of working age with elderly parents and children, perhaps with their own difficulties. And there was a financial pressure on a lot of people who might be relying on an inheritance to come down from a earlier age. We've been seeing here in the UK the sort of idea of the great wealth transfer that is an issue for people expecting money to come to them. And unfortunately, with people living long, there's a need to pay out a lot of money for care fees, but then it's a case of, what does that look like? What does that have an effect on somebody who might be expecting that inheritance? And then they might say, well, it's what my mother would have wanted, so I'll take that extra £1,000 from the bank account. I'll take that money for a conservatory or a holiday, and it's what she would have wanted. And you can see very easily how these disputes might start. And so one of the things we're really keen to do is actually talk about safeguarding issues and how we can safeguard people to ensure that things are being looked after properly. So hopefully Jane will be able to make this into a video for me. So you'll see sort of very briefly a video there, and I think Jane and I have agreed probably the sensible thing to do is to get that sort of circulated after the end. But what STEP's done, we've really been working hard on a Spot the Signs campaign. Phrases such as what they want and don't worry about it, and actually spotting financial abuse can be quite hard because it can be very subtle. It can be somebody taking somebody shopping in a supermarket that they're not usually used to attending. So you might have somebody who would have gone to a very sort of high-end supermarket and suddenly they're going to a budget supermarket, or the other way around, where they used to be very cost conscious and suddenly they're spending money on an awful lot of expensive food. And when their carer or the person who's supporting them is taking them to that supermarket, who's getting the benefit of all of that shopping? And I think in one of the campaigns that we did, we sort of said it's things like somebody's bought a lawnmower, but they don't have a lawn to mow because they no longer gardening. So an expensive piece of machinery that is no longer valid or relevant to the person who's got dementia or capacity issues can be a thing to spot. And it is hard, it is difficult, and we understand that people want to support family and family want to be supported. But there are laws surrounding what you can and can't do as an attorney. And I was talking to somebody this week about what they could do for tax planning, because that's the big concern. They said, oh, my mother's got a very large tax bill and they're very worried that they're going to pay a lot of tax. But, you can't just take that money and put it in your bank account without approval. There is a risk that that could be seen as theft. And that's a real risk for a lot of people and a lot of problems. But so I think it's really understanding this is it's a very complicated area. You've got a complicated illness with dementia and those sort of brain injuries. Then you've got complications of how that money is then managed. So if you want to scan the QR code, you can have a look at the resources there, or you can go on the website. And as these slides are going to be circulated, I won't dwell on this too much, but it's worth having a look if this is something that concerns you or think might concern you. And you'll see that STEP's got some fantastic resources aimed at everybody, really, who might be caring for somebody else, thinking about planning for their future, managing money. What does it mean when I've got power of attorney? And why, if that that once you've got to that stage, you still need more support, why STEP can then perhaps be a place to come to for assistance. So thank you very much. I will now pass back.
Thank you very much, Heledd. And can I remind everybody that the STEP materials will be available after this webinar, but most critically, our webinar participants are also available to answer specific questions at the Q&A. So if you have questions or even stories to share about how you have witnessed financial abuse, please put them on the Q&A box so that we can have a discussion later about that. We are extremely lucky to have STEP with us. We are talking of practitioners that work in individual countries, day in, day out, with families that have this kind of problem. And David Abednego is going to talk to us in a minute a little bit more about that. Before I hand the floor to David, though, can I ask you for your forgiveness vis-a-vis slides? We've had some problems with the showing of the slides, but this is not a problem for you at home. We got well over 220 people online. We will make sure that whatever materials you need can be delivered to you separately after the webinar. We hope that this is not a problem for everybody. A few people have been seeing black boxes over their slides. We are not entirely sure why that has happened. So sorry about that. We hope that the problem will have been sorted now. So now I'm handing the floor to David Abednego, who is a managing partner at Harbour Chambers, British Virgin Island. I can see that there's quite a few of the members of ADI from the British Virgin Island on the line. So thank you guys for contributing specifically to us today, the case study for an individual nation. Thank you, David. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. And good day to all of the attendees here on the presentation. So yes, so this presentation is as it relates to elderly persons and dementia patients as here in the British Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. Financial abuse involves controlling a person's financial resources or manipulating their financial decisions for personal gains. The elderly, disabled, and economically disadvantaged individuals are often the most affected. In my legal practice, my involvement deals with the elderly in general and Alzheimer patients at various stages of the disease. Next slide, please. The elderly and dementia patients are vulnerable for various assorted reasons. Cognitive decline being one of the greatest ones. As we are well aware, dementia patients often struggle with memory, making it difficult to keep track of financial transactions, remembering where they keep their money, or recognizing financial discrepancies. There's also the issue of impaired judgment. With the cognitive decline, it affects their ability to make sound financial decisions, assess risk, and recognize fraudulent schemes. Confusion. Patients may become easily confused about their finances, leading to unintentional errors or misinterpretations. Next slide, please. Because dementia can lead to decreased social interactions and isolation, it becomes easier for abusers to take advantage of these patients without it being detected. Here in the BVI, there is a silent practice of locking away elderly persons who are not mobile. And this, of course, also includes persons suffering with Alzheimer's. There's also become vulnerable due to dependency on the caregivers. So as dementia and old age person progresses, many patients become increasingly dependent on caregivers for the daily tasks, which of course include financial management. This dependency, we have found, leads to exploitation by unscrupulous individuals. Next slide, please. The vulnerability occurs as well from trust and manipulation. Dementia and elderly patients may overly trust caregivers, family members, or friends, making them susceptible to manipulation and deceit. There's also emotional manipulation. Abusers may use emotional manipulation to gain control over the patient's finances, exploiting their emotional vulnerability. Example can consist of a caretaker who happens to be a child of the patient, constantly hammering into the patient's head that he or she is the only child caring for that patient, and he or she is the only one who is always there. Furthermore, we found when that parent is sick, that child is always asking that parent, where are the other children? Where are they here to assist? We also found that dementia patients, of course, find it challenging to navigate complex financial systems, such as managing bank accounts and paying bills. Next slide, please. In the BVI, land ownership is the gold standard for living. So whether we are dealing with raw land or a small property with a residential home, the desire is to get your name, or at a minimum, be able to control a piece of the island. In BVI, the profile for a potential victim is a cognitive declining Christian faith-based landowner with a healthy bank account. These persons in our small society are not hard to find. They are very common. In my experience, the common abusers are the caretakers, family members, and fellow parishioners. In the BVI, we have dealt with instances where caretakers have married the elderly person on a Saturday, then proceeded on the Monday to have their names added to bank accounts and visiting us to have person's will rewritten. We have also dealt with instances where a parishioner told an elderly church brother that the Lord in a vision sent her to take care of that person until he died, and in return, he is to transfer his land to her. Next slide, please. What are some of the signs of financial abuse? Unusual bank activity, frequent or unexplained withdrawals, transfers, or large purchases that are out of the ordinary for the patient's spending habits. Bank employees, I'm happy to say, are now being trained to keep an eye out for suspicious activities involving account of seniors. So situations where you have seniors who are accustomed of withdrawing $300 or $400 regularly, all of a sudden you're seeing that they're making large deposits, $1,500, $2,000, which is out of the ordinary. So employees are now being trained to keep an eye out for these type of activities and asking questions. There's also forced financial decisions. The patient may be coerced into making financial decisions, such as signing documents or transferring funds against their will. Power of attorney. As much as I would recommend power of attorney documents, the person with power of attorney may misuse their authority to control the victim's finances for personal gain. Next slide, please. There are also manipulative tactics. The abuser may use threats or intimidation to force the victim into financial decisions or to prevent them from seeking help. We've also been involved in our practice in instances where a search of the kitchen cupboard of elderly client, we saw a variety of foods that were more suited for the caretaker and her family than the elderly person. The elderly person had missed key medical appointments, and medication that should have been refilled had been left vacant. And when questioned from the caretaker, the response was simple: she was too busy to be bothered. In other example, an elderly lady who was in charge of large tracts of land was taken advantage of by family members and friends who had purchased land from her for way below the market value and who was offered to pay by installments. However, once the property was transferred into the purchaser's names, all further installment payments had ceased. Next slide, please. So how can we prevent financial abuse? Some of the ways to minimize financial abuse involves having the power of attorney, where you appoint a trusted individual to manage finances, where that individual becomes incapacitated. The idea is that this should ensure that financial decisions are made in the best interest of the individual. There is also guardianship. Legal guardianship can protect the individual's assets and finances from exploitation. In BVI, with legal guardianship, there is usually a requirement to submit quarterly reports to the court on the care and conduct of that patient. Also, there's regular monitoring. Regularly reviewing the bank statements, credit card bills, and other financial records to detect any unusual activity. If you're a family member, you ought to be suspicious. When regular communication has been cut off from that elderly person, you ought to be suspicious. Be also suspicious when the caretaker remains present during visitation or when you are on the phone with the patient. Oftentimes, this is because they're guarding the person, so the person cannot give you any indication that something is wrong. Education and awareness. Educating individuals about the common scams, fraudulent schemes, such as lottery scams and investment fraud, is always something that should be ongoing. You also want to encourage individuals to protect their personal information, such as their social security numbers, bank account details, and password. Also important is to store important documents, such as wills, deeds, and financial records in a secure location. Final slide. So in summary, financial abuse, as we all know, is a serious issue for elderly and dementia patients. It requires vigilance and proactive measures. We should all encourage ourselves, family, caregivers, and community to stay informed and protect vulnerable individuals. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. Such an interesting and applied presentation. This was very practical. I can see there are a number of questions coming in. Thank you, everybody. We'll try our best to answer them later. Now I am going to hand over the floor to Daphne Franks, who is a campaigner for Predatory Marriage UK. You will be wondering what that does, and the presentation of Daphne will explain it abundantly. So Daphne, the floor is yours. Daphne, you need to unmute yourself.
Always one. Sorry. My mother, Joan Blass, who was a widow, died at home. She was nearly 92 with advanced vascular dementia and terminal cancer. 2 days later, we got a phone call from my mother's doctor, and he sounded worried. He said, "Daphne, did you know your mother was married?" And that was when the bottom dropped out of our world. So this is a story of predatory marriage, which is a term we have borrowed from Canada, thanks to those people who are from Canada who I see are here. And it's beginning to be widely used in the UK. It's generally defined as when a younger person marries a much older person purely for the purpose of gaining access to their estate. Our case had very many signs that financial abuse was happening, but at the time, back in 2015 or so, the authorities either didn't see the threat or didn't know what to do. There is a lot of overlap with grooming and gaslighting, and especially coercive control. I'd like to say straight out that I'm not blaming any individual or any group for what happened. It was almost all caused by the laws and procedures at marriage not keeping up with the huge rise in dementia and people not being trained to spot the signs. So my mother died on Easter Saturday. On Easter Tuesday, the man arrived at Mum's doctor's surgery with a marriage certificate, and that's how we found out about the secret marriage. He had married her on the 26th of October, 5 months to the day before she died. At the time, he was 67, and my mother was nearly 92, with a 5-year history of diagnosed worsening vascular dementia. The witnesses to the wedding were the man's son and a lady from the pub. None of my mother's family or friends was present. None of us knew it was happening. We lived next door. We saw my mother several times a day, and I had registered power of attorney. We set about trying to find out how the marriage could possibly have taken place. So going back in time, here are my parents in their 80s. They were both from very poor backgrounds. My father was born in the slums and worked very hard to become a pharmacist. My mother was also from a poor background. Any money they had earned. She was very sporty and very academic. She won a scholarship to university, then worked as a journalist, and then became a much-loved teacher. Here is my mum in her 80s on a 5-mile walk. And here she is, age 89, diving into a pool. She had dementia at that time, but she could still dive and still swim. She looked younger than her age, but that's not the point. Proper procedures would have stopped the wedding. Here she is on one of her favourite beaches making a sandcastle, and I'll come back to that sandcastle at the end of the talk. The man just seemed to turn up on her doorstep and was suddenly living with her. She didn't know his name, she never knew it, or even that he was living there. He began by being very over-friendly to the whole family, and then as the years went on, as time went on, he became colder and colder and more controlling. And I have spoken to lots of other cases now, and this is a very common pattern for all the predators. We went to all the authorities saying how vulnerable my mother was, but nobody did anything. They didn't know what to do. This is what my mum's bedroom looked like a few months after the man moved in. It had been a very neat, tidy little old lady bedroom, and now it looked like this. And we were horrified. The man is a hoarder. He also called himself her carer. And whenever he said this, nobody ever asked another question. They never asked her, are you a paid carer? Where did you come from? They never asked another question. He used her debit card in the supermarket without her even being there. And when challenged, he said, oh, she's an old lady. I'm her carer. And everyone went, oh, that's all right then. Not, you are committing fraud. Before my mother's death, we sought help from my mother's GP, and they didn't know what to do and suggested we call social services. Social services were very sympathetic. They sent someone round, but in England and Wales, they have no right of entry into the house. They have in Scotland. And they did go round, but I think he charmed them away and they never saw Mum's bedroom. We went to the police and a policeman wrote everything down and then said, oh, people will say you just don't like him. We went to the family solicitor who assured us that she wouldn't be able to marry or to make a new will because of her 5-year history of diagnosed vascular dementia, which is mentioned repeatedly through her medical records. We found a lot of problems after my mother's death. In England and Wales, though not in Scotland, marriage revokes a will as though it had never existed. So my mother had made a will in 2004, leaving everything to myself and my brother. And now we heard everywhere, your mother died intestate without a will. This was very distressing because she put a lot of effort into making a very good will. The marriage now gave the man complete control of my mother's funeral and possessions, and he inherited the first 270,000 of her estate, which in her case was all of it. Everyone constantly said to us, why don't you go in the house and get the things? And there was a lot of items of sentimental value in Mum's house, nothing valuable, but my wedding dress, my granddad's letters from the First World War. And I kept having to explain they're not our things anymore. He has inherited them. He didn't have to invite us to Mum's funeral, so he didn't, and we couldn't go. And that is the hardest thing that I have found to get over. In 2004, my mother had set up enduring power of attorney so I could look after her affairs if she lost mental capacity to do so. To many people's surprise, in the UK, power of attorney has no link with marriage. There was no requirement, no method, no mechanism to tell the attorney, me, if the donor, my mum, plans to marry. And this applies to the newer lasting power of attorney too. It's something that just isn't there, but everyone assumes it is there. The lack of safeguarding at marriage was horrendous. There are no robust procedures, no standard list of questions. Registrars who marry people are not highly trained, not highly paid, not trained in mental capacity or safeguarding, but are yet expected to assess capacity to marry at every wedding they do in about 5 minutes. They should do separate interviews, but they don't always do them in separate rooms because of lack of basic safeguarding training and because it's not mandatory. Misunderstanding of the Mental Capacity Act. People often take it to mean you should just assume that they know what they're doing, no matter what they say or do, and that is not the case. And no accountability if procedures are not followed. It's very difficult for registrars to stop a wedding. They have been threatened with physical violence and being sued for the cost of the honeymoon. This is why I've never blamed the registrars. The registrars said in a letter that the man had told them before the wedding that my mother was very old, true, was very deaf, true, was terminally ill, true, had had a stroke, true, and was forgetful, all true. But he didn't mention my mother's 5-year history of diagnosed vascular dementia. She smiled all the time. They assumed because she was smiling, she must know what she was doing. So it is lack of procedures, and as I said, that's why I have not blamed the registrars for what happened. We went to our Member of Parliament and he took it to Parliament. The bill was passed unanimously for a second reading, but then ran out of parliamentary time. But Fabian Hamilton, who is on the left there with a beard, has never stopped campaigning for us, and that's me and my husband when we went to Parliament. The man who married my mother, you have to pay attention to what he does, not to what he says. He insisted that my mother should be buried when she'd always wanted to be cremated, and all the other cases, and I've spoken to hundreds now, they all seem to do the same. He kept all the money and possessions and refused to leave the house. 6 months after Mum's death, he used her blue disabled badge to park his car and was caught and prosecuted and failed to pay the fine. And a year later, he remarried to another elderly lady who lived very near my mother. The predators tend to be charming. I cannot overemphasize this. The victims tend to have vulnerabilities. The relatives, we tend to sound a bit hysterical, but the predators are charming and plausible and very manipulative. And when crossed or challenged, very scary. And that combination is very difficult to deal with. Marriage revoking a will in England dates from the 1837 Wills Act. Changing this law wouldn't sort it completely, but I think, and many solicitors think, that it would remove some of the incentive. It would take away an easy win for the predators, but also better safeguarding at marriage is needed, plus joined up safeguarding between different organisations to address coercive control, and more training of everyone in dementia and spotting the signs of abuse. I've done a lot of campaigning. If anyone would like me to give a talk to their organisation, do please get in touch. I will put my contact details in the chat. And we have made a lot of progress, but there's still a fair way to go. This is my mother's grave. The man has not put up a headstone, and we are not allowed to because he owns the grave plot. So not being able to go to her funeral and not being able to put up a headstone is absolutely heartbreaking and something it's very hard to come to terms with. And finally, I showed you my mum making a sandcastle earlier on in the talk, and this is what she wrote underneath. Joan was here, and I'm not going to let her be forgotten. Massive thanks to everyone for listening and to everybody who has helped with our campaign. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. I'd be very happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Thank you so much, Daphne, for this extraordinary and sort of emotional and passionate story told so simply to us. And yet you have been through hell and back, and especially in the last slide, we just realize how awful this must have been for you and all of your family. So thank you for sharing. We will have time for questions at the end. So please ask you again if you could post your questions for Daphne, specifically on her experience, in the Q&A. We will try and answer as many questions as we can at the end. Now, please let me hand over the floor to our last but not least speaker, Jennifer Hall, the Head of National Support Services of Alzheimer Scotland. We wanted the end of this webinar to be about action, to be about what can be done by national organizations. ADI is an organization of national organizations that work towards Alzheimer's and dementia, better awareness and practical advice and services for families. So Jennifer will have direct experience of people going to them with questions and what can be done about it, and hopefully inspire all of us to take a lot of what we've learned forward. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paola, and thank you so much. That's been incredible to hear those previous presentations, particularly yours, Daphne. I don't quite know how to follow that. I'm absolutely horrified about that experience that you've had. And I think it just highlights the absolute significance and importance that we continue this conversation, that we take every opportunity that we can to raise awareness and to be aware of those signs. A really extreme example there, but also those subtleties that Heledd had shared earlier as well, because it is such a diverse area when we're talking about financial abuse and financial harm. So my name is Jen Hall. I'm from Alzheimer Scotland. I'm based in Glasgow, so I do apologise for my broad Scottish accent. I hope that it does not require subtitles and I'm not speaking too fast, because that is certainly feedback that we Scots have had before. Can I have the next slide, please? So just before I get into the detail of my presentation, I thought it might be worth telling you a bit about who Alzheimer Scotland is and what we provide in Scotland. So we are Scotland's leading dementia charity. We're a large organisation. We are there to provide support and information to people impacted by dementia in Scotland. However, it doesn't exclusively mean Scotland. We do support people across the globe that have family that are currently living in Scotland. And we're very much a campaigning organisation. We have a human rights-based approach to how we do that. And we strongly campaign for the rights of people living with dementia and their carers in Scotland. And we fund two of our active voice groups, who you may be familiar with. They are the Scottish Dementia Working Group, who are made up of a group of lived experience, so people with a diagnosis of dementia. And the other group there are the National Dementia Carer Action Network, who are made up of people who have cared for a loved one living with dementia. We also play a part in funding vital dementia research, and we are members of Alzheimer's Disease International and Alzheimer's Europe, and it is an absolute pleasure to be here today to share some insights from our perspective. Next slide, please. So I am Head of National Support Services with Alzheimer Scotland, and within my remit, I am responsible for our 24-hour free phone dementia helpline, which is a volunteer-led service, and people can contact us on our helpline 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And I'm incredibly proud to be part of that team, because I think it is an exceptional offering that we have in Scotland for people to use. And that helpline is there to provide information, support, and signposting onto other sources of support that may be appropriate. And the other service that I'm responsible for is our National Dementia Advisor Service. And that is a collection of 15 specialist dementia advisors who are there to support people who are impacted by dementia. And they're available Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, but they take on a caseload. And it's really through these two main national services that we have that I hear firsthand the experience of harm, particularly that experience of financial harm and abuse and neglect that can sometimes unfortunately we can hear about. The important thing to say there is what do we do in those situations. So if I can just have the next slide, please. Thank you. So in Scotland, we do have a legal protection. We've got a piece of law which is called Adult Support and Protection Scotland Act, and that came into force in 2007. And this Act is there to protect people who are unable to safeguard their own well-being, property, rights or other interests, people who are at risk of harm, and I'll talk a wee bit more about that in a second, and people who are affected by disability, mental disorder, illness, physical or mental infirmity, or are more vulnerable to being harmed than adults who are not so affected. So that is the legislation that Scotland has to use, and I suppose it is the most important piece of legislation that we have when organisations such as Alzheimer Scotland or any other statutory body, so it might be the police, the NHS, so a doctor, a GP, for example, or a medical professional, or social services, or people that are in housing. But if someone is made aware, if somebody discloses, suspects, or is made aware that harm is taking place, then that places a duty on us to share that information and to act in the best interests of the adult if they meet this criteria, these 3 points here that's on my screen. Now, it's quite a broad heading, and I've only got 8 minutes here, so I don't want to go into too much detail about what we mean by harm, but it is a diverse heading, and in relation to this, it does cover people who are, experiencing unlawful conduct which appropriates or adversely affects property rights or other interests. So that includes things like theft, fraud, embezzlement, or extortion. Can I have the next slide, please? So just to kind of summarise there, what our organisation do in instances where we are made aware of financial harm or abuse taking place, we can provide information, and honestly, information, knowledge is power in any case. We play a huge part in trying to empower individuals to know and claim their rights. And information is a huge part of that. So by being able to provide accurate, up-to-date, evidence-based information to people who are concerned about financial harm is really instrumental here. And also our dementia advisors and our post-diagnostic support link workers can provide advice to people living with dementia, concerned family members and or friends who are making inquiries about safeguarding from financial harm. We've heard some specific examples today, but there's always, with Alzheimer Scotland, we're always hearing different perspectives, and a lot of the time we hear about those really difficult, complex family dynamics that people might be experiencing. And often, you might hear complaints from people that are holding powers of attorney, or other siblings that are maybe got concerns about how the person with powers of attorney is acting in the interests of the individual with dementia. And that's where signposting onto other resources can become really, really important there. So signposts that we would make, for example, might be onto the Office of Public Guardian and the Mental Welfare Commission, just to get further information and advice on what next. It's an incredibly complex area, and I think part of this legislation is that it's about information sharing in the interests of the individual. And it's about as much about supporting the individual around safeguarding against harm as it is about protection. But this is only as good as the people that sharing that information. So it's crucial that if there is concerns, that we are passing that on. So as an Alzheimer's organisation, we do have a part to play there. And by raising alarm, by raising concerns with the local authority, that places a legal duty on them to make inquiries about the individual where those concerns are raised. So that's ultimately what we can do as an association there to safeguard adults who may be at risk of financial abuse. But it is, it is an incredibly concerning area, and it is something that I think we need to be having more conversation about and raising more awareness about. And just I'll leave you with a final kind of reflection. There was quite a shocking statistic that I read on the Action for Elder Abuse website just yesterday actually, and that there's estimated to be 44% of all cases of financial abuse that's taken place is actually taking place in the family home by members of the family or people that are closely linked to that individual, which I thought was very shocking and really, really concerning. That on top of the sophisticated scams that's taking place out there now, that we're hearing more about every day, and how that can compromise individuals that are more vulnerable or susceptible to that, I think is something that we need to be doubly cautious about. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share just some brief insights with you today. And I'll hand back to the panel now, and happy to take any questions if there's time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's great to see what practically can be done and how complex it is what can be done, and how the legal and political framework of a country is absolutely essential, as we keep saying, to get stuff done properly, because a lot of what is happening here is complex and is very complex to unravel. And some of the questions in the Q&A box kind of point exactly to that. Well, I'm going to ask now our panelists to be quite quick in their response, and I'm going to try and pick up some of the questions. And I know that some of you may have a view on also some other of the questions. So we will try and make this as a proper conversation. And Jane is now putting our faces all on the screen. Now, the first question I'm going to ask is going to be addressed to Heledd. At what point, Heledd, can a person living with dementia be involved in decisions regarding the legal protections against financial abuse, particularly in cases where the person is in the advanced stage of the condition?
Hi, yeah, so in England and Wales, we've got the Mental Capacity Act, and one of the fundamental principles is that somebody must be assumed to have capacity until demonstrated they don't. So the starting point should always be including and encouraging the person who's got dementia to be involved. But if it becomes apparent that they're struggling or it's too hard for them because of lots of reasons, then maybe getting an independent capacity assessment, say they can't make that decision, and then their legal representative or say their attorney can step in at that point.
Thank you very much. That is very helpful. Once again, that's why it's important to have people like Heledd advising properly about also the the legal position of each country, which is of course completely different from country to country. David, there's been a few questions for you. The first one that I'm going to tackle is, I'm interested in knowing one best case example in the British Islands, a positive experience, David, if you have one, where financial counseling or the training of bank staff, for example, may have helped the family in avoiding financial abuse.
Yes, there certainly have been some positive examples. However, they would have occurred still after certain abuse had taken place. So in one specific example, this gentleman had already withdrawn several unusual transactions, at least 4 or 5 times, before the bank staff really then picked up on it. And what they have done, given the size of our community, because of the size and knowing the family, they were able to call, actually in this case, they called the niece of this particular client, and just kind of, without being specific in terms of what is happening, ask some questions, well, how is the family? Is everything okay? Is someone sick? Just trying to get a feel without truly disclosing the reason behind of it. And once they, kind of based on the training, they realize, okay, so as it relates to the family home, the family setting, nothing was out of the ordinary. Then they start trying to understand, well, where these large transactions are going. So there've been that type of situation.
Thank you very much. That has got a lot of food for thought. But as you said, in these particular cases, I imagine in many, you can do something afterwards. But of course, it's quite difficult to do something preventatively. I think I should ask the same question actually to Jennifer. Jennifer, because you may have seen some positive cases after your intervention.
Absolutely. And I think that is key. Information sharing and organisations being able to speak to each other is really important there.
Lovely. Thank you so much. It's funny, actually, I should remark, Jennifer, on you making your point about your accent. The poor people that follow us on Alzheimer's Disease International webinar have had to cope with my accent for all these years. My accent is way harder to understand than yours, your lovely Scottish accent. So thank you so much. David, I've got another question for you here. If you could actually answer that, that'd be quite interesting. Of course, you'll have to elaborate on it a bit. Did you not find the power of attorney is the means to exploitation?
If it's the means, I found that persons having power of attorney in many cases tend to take the position as if they are now the owners of the assets, and certainly not in the majority of cases, but certainly have treated it, well, they have power of attorney and they can certainly go and make decisions not necessarily in the best interest of the patient. So it's not to say whoever gets this power of attorney are necessarily the best persons, because in many cases, we found persons who do have mean intentions are the one who are pushing to have this power of attorney. You know, certainly if they know they want to have this authority so they can be the one in control. So they have certainly used the power of attorney to benefit them personally.
And I can see that Daphne, for which I've got the next question, is putting her hand up because I bet you've got something to say about the POA.
Yes, two points actually. The first point about power of attorney is the MP, our MP Fabian Hamilton, who raised predatory marriage in Parliament, has also raised the abuse of power of attorney in Parliament. And his bill has a second reading in June, so I'm pleased about that. A lot of that abuse is coming from predatory sons and daughters. But on the other hand, there are problems with the power of attorney in that there's no link with marriage. The other point I wanted to make is I have heard of registrars, 2 registrars who have stopped predatory marriages because they came up to me, they had heard my talk, and all they did was separate the people into separate rooms. And for example, one was an old lady, and they said to her, "Do you know why you're here?" And she said, "No, why am I here?" So that was the end of that marriage. And the other was an old man, and they said, "Do you know why you're here?" And he said, "She's making me marry her and I don't want to." So sometimes it's just simple steps, more training that can really be vital in preventing the abuse of our elderly. Thank you.
So lovely, Daphne. Such a good point that. And when I was in Xi'an last autumn and Steph did another financial awareness webinar, and we had this wonderful lawyer from China speaking about it, he remarked how in a particular case where the person that did the power of attorney instead was at risk of financial abuse, and he wanted to give the power of attorney to a neighbor that he trusted rather than his family. The solicitor that did that was clever enough to record the interview, a proper interview, sitting down and asking all those questions and asking them at length, so that when then it was challenged by the family, it was clear that the person, when he had done that, was in the full possession of their capacity. So that is the other thing, that you can go to a professional that is not so thorough. As you say, there's nothing to blame. Sometimes people are just given a set of questions to ask, and that's where it ends there. But Daphne, I had another question for you that was in the Q&A box. Now I can't find it anymore, but I remember it, which was whether you could have challenged the marriage of your mother.
No, we couldn't, unfortunately. And this is what's called the predatory marriage trap. There are 2 things here. One, you can't annul a marriage in the UK after one party's died, unless it was bigamous or incestuous, and this was neither. But the main thing is the police tried to prosecute the man for forced marriage. And unfortunately, they said, but there's no evidence kept at marriage. Her 5-year history of dementia didn't count. What if she made a miracle recovery on the day? We know she didn't, because the registrars wrote a letter saying she couldn't answer any of the questions. But even so, the Crown Prosecution Service said that wasn't enough to prosecute. I wanted the man prosecuted, not to be sent to jail, just to make an example of him, to stop other people doing it, because I've spoken to so many cases. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. That's such a good one. We got little time, so I'd like to move on to Jennifer. Jennifer, there are two questions here that are linked. One says, what power do you have when you recognize the harm has occurred? The other one is broader, which is what authority does an Alzheimer organization to intervene in financial abuse, which of course depends on the legal framework you're operating in. And I'd like to point out, for those of you that are not in an Anglo-Saxon legal system, the power of attorney still does not exist in many organizations. It's a specific legal instrument that exists in certain countries. So Jennifer, what power do you have when you recognize that the harm has occurred?
So in terms of our organisation, there's not necessarily power that we have. What we can do is share that information. So we have a duty to report where we are made aware of, where we suspect, or somebody discloses that harm has taken place. So what we would do there is, and it looks different depending on the local authority area, so the part of Scotland that the person is living in, we would then use what's called an AP1 form, so an adult protection concern form, which often can be done online via the local authority's website. So we would raise that concern, and the power is then, the ball is in the local authority's court. So that legislation, the adult support and protection legislation that I was talking about, that gives the local authority the power to investigate whether they have been alerted to harm. So the legal duty is really, the power there falls to them to make investigations and inquiries where they're made aware of that. And sorry, Paola, what was the second part of that question?
So the second part was generally, what authority does an Alzheimer organization have in intervening in financial abuse? Do you know what authority exactly does Alzheimer Scotland have? I imagine it's limited.
It is limited. It is limited. And since COVID, Alzheimer's Scotland has created the National Dementia Advisor Service, and there's more information on our website about that. So the reason that we created that support was to respond to the level of need that we were hearing through our helpline and through our other support channels, where people were really in a lot of crisis situations and they were requiring more support to navigate, which is often a complex health and social care system. So what we can do there is our dementia advisors can lean in and support families that are in crisis there, to complain, to raise concern, just to really advocate for them and strengthen their voice there. So we're not independent advocates, that's something that's quite different, but we can lean into those situations and support where it's appropriate, which has really been helping a lot of families out there in Scotland.
Thank you so much. There are two questions I'd still like to ask the panel. One is a broad question, really. It's come from many angles. A lot of it is around banks, whether banks can be trained, what can banks do, as a lot of financial abuse seems to be centering around banks and use of cards. There's also been some question relating to scams. So would any of our speakers like to specifically discuss what have they done in relation to banks and in relation to scams?
I can take banks because I can tell you about a client of mine who was an attorney, and he was acting for attorney for his father, and he made a bank transfer and the bank stopped it. And the bank stopped the transaction and reported him to, in England and Wales, the Office of the Public Guardian, who oversees attorneys. And he was investigated as to why that was done. So it does happen if there are odd transactions or big transactions or unusual transactions, the banks will look at it. So but it's possibly the low level stuff is harder to spot.
Fabulous, that's really helpful. Anyone else wants to come in on that one?
Sorry, not the bank side of things, but certainly the scams. I can offer comment on that. I'll wait and see if there's anyone else.
No, go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, sorry. Yes, so in relation to scams, there has been, if we hear through our helpline that there's potential scammers in the area, that might be door-to-door fundraisers, that they're questioning are they genuine fundraisers or is this scams? Or if people, there was a recent one up in Highland, I think, or Tayside, where there was people selling NHS equipment. They weren't from the NHS, they were scammers. So where we're made aware of situations like that, we can update our website. We use social media to raise awareness, to make people aware. So it's a really simple, suggestion, but it is just about where we're made aware of these things. We want to make sure that people are informed about that. So we will go public quite quickly to try and raise as much awareness about that to protect people as possible.
That is such a good point. The important thing is to identify these things and telling people about it, and slowly it kind of seeps through. Sadly, the scammers always seem to be one step ahead, but at the same time, we need to know, and a lot of scams have been going around for years, undetected and unchallenged, because again, there's not been enough sharing of information. Thank you, Jennifer. My last question is coming out of one of the comments of David in one of his slides. David, you spoke about legal protections, about the possibility of having a trusted contact. And I remember a few years ago speaking with guardianship with the government, they had a way to appoint a guardian, a trusted contact for people who lived alone with dementia, where there was no family and there was no support. And that person would also have discussions beforehand with the person that had developed dementia. So this question is also related to a discussion in the chat line around what can you do when people have mild cognitive impairment. So when you can see the sign that is not quite there. And David, you spoke with a trusted contact. How do you suggest that people should identify a trusted contact? How can you trust the trusted contact?
In the BVI, in some cases, before one is appointed, in this case, let's say they're appointed as a guardian under the guardianship legislation, the court gets involved, and our social services department, they have also been involved in providing certain report to the individual. I can't say how do you trust the trusted contact. It's tough because we have had scenarios where suddenly you thought you had persons who were trusted. They turn out to be terrible money managers. They may have been trustworthy, in terms of caring, but financial wise, money management, very poor money management habits that ultimately hurt the client, the patient.
Thank you so much, David. This is all we have for today. I know, Jennifer, you wanted to add something. 10 seconds.
Just quickly, just on the powers of attorney, I think powers of attorney is something that is given to people, to a trusted individual, but I don't think there's enough awareness when that power is given about the principles within the Act and what their duties are there, what they're responsible for doing if that needs to be enacted. So I think that's maybe a conversation for another day, but just last comment from myself. Thank you.
Very, very fair comment. Again, for those of you that don't have powers of attorney in your country, this may not be relevant to you, but still there may be other mechanisms that are similar. Well, that's all we have for today. So I thank Emilia, my panelists. We had a lot of people online that stayed until the end with us, so a lot of interest in this topic. It was very practical. I hope that many of you saw how this is an issue that is shared by a lot of us, and there is a lot to learn by ourselves, keeping ourselves aware of what can be done to protect those that we care for the most. So thank you, panelists, for being with me. The conversation will be available online, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And as ever, come and continue to be online with us for our next one that Jane will send you more information with in due course. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.